we're going to talk about, oh, hey, and welcome to today's workshop on self-editing. Today we're going to talk about how to upgrade your novel so you can strengthen your writing by following a self-editing framework. And first I'm going to tell you all a little bit about myself, because why am I talking about this subject at all? My name is Elzevera. I am Dutch. I live in the Netherlands, and I am a professional editor turned self-editing coach on a mission to help writers take control of the quality of their writing and publish without regrets by teaching them to self-edit effectively and efficiently. So what does that mean? I studied psychology to start with, and then I did a master's in editing when I realized that I really missed working with all things to do with writing and editing. And I discovered that when I started working as a professional editor, I discovered that many writers don't take full advantage of the self-editing stage, which is such a shame. I would, during my internship at a children's publishing house, I would see the slush pile, and the quality of the manuscripts in there was so bad sometimes that I wondered why those writers didn't put in that extra bit of TLC to make sure that the manuscript was at the best it could be before they submitted it to a publisher, which would then have the editor who reads the manuscript be much happier about the conditions and about the prospect of working with that author who had already shown that they were willing to put in the work to create a book that's as good as it can be. And the same goes for self-publishing authors. I would see so many self-published authors who had published and be stoked that they had published their book, but then really regret how the process went down because they didn't self-edit, or they didn't self-edit thoroughly. So based on that, I decided to make it my mission to guide fiction writers through the self-editing process, because self-editing has always come very naturally to me. It's the part of the process that I enjoy most, and I have a hard time getting the draft down. But once it's down, I really enjoy making sure that everything sounds the way it's supposed to sound, that I convey what I want to convey, that the characters are behaving like themselves, all those kinds of things. And I want to give writers the tools to feel confident as they self-edit their novel, so that they can be sure that they've covered every single base they can. So I'm going to talk you through that framework, the framework that I created today. Move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about the power of a framework and why and how you would want to follow an editing framework. I'm going to share some tips and tricks, like move from big to small and focus on a single thing at a time. This will make sense when we dive into the topic. And then at the end, I have a special offer for you all, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask any questions you have. So what is a self-editing framework? It's a series of steps to follow, like a checklist. And I actually created what's called the self-editing roadmap that lists every single step of the self-editing process from start to finish. And a framework helps you make sure that you're not forgetting anything, that you're focused on the step at hand, and that you're going through your manuscript in a way that's going to get you results, instead of just reading through again and again and just hoping to come across something that you can polish or improve. So a framework brings peace of mind and control. And that feeling of control is something that, in my experience, a lot of writers don't feel. When they're drafting, they feel in control because they're putting the words on the page, they're coming up with a story. But then once that first draft is done, that feeling of control tends to disappear. And in my experience, that's because of several things. One is that they're not sure how to proceed. They know that revisions are part of the process, but what do revisions look like? Another reason is that they know sort of what the self-editing process entails, but it's so many steps that they feel overwhelmed. and they're not sure in which order to tackle these things. They're not sure what to pay attention to. And it feels like so many things to look for at once that they may not do as well as they could when they would have had a framework. So when you follow a self-editing framework, you have a full overview of the entire self-editing process. You don't have to worry about missing anything. You always know what's next, and you get the satisfaction of checking items off. At least I always find that super satisfying. So how does that work? How do you get a framework? You can either put together a list yourself based on research. You can find anything you want to know on Google. If you search long enough, if you know where to look, you can put everything together yourself. But there's always a guessing element because you don't know what you don't know. And there's always that feeling of, what am I missing? And am I doing enough? And the feeling of that you should be doing more. So instead, there's also the option of getting a ready-made framework. And when I started as a self-editing coach, that did not exist. So I created a self-editing framework based on my own experience, based on my own process, and based on the struggles that I've heard from fellow writers, the things that they've shared with me that they are experiencing as roadblocks as they try to self-edit. I've incorporated those things into the framework to make sure that those roadblocks are not roadblocks anymore, so that you can get past them. So what does self-editing your novel look like from start to finish? There are two major things that I would like you to keep in mind. Number one is what I mentioned in the overview of what we're going to talk about today: move from big to small. This is one of the first things that I learned as I did my master's in editing. They told us, don't line edit before you are absolutely sure that the structure is sound. And before they told me this, I would also correct spelling mistakes, correct grammar mistakes, because those are like the easy fixes. You see them straight away, you fix them straight away, and that makes you feel like you're saving time because you're taking care of everything as soon as you come across it. But what I learned and what experience has shown me is that it's much harder to work with the structure when you've already spent a ton of time line editing, polishing your sentences, choosing exactly the right word. When you've done that with an entire passage, and then you look at the big picture, you look at your plot, and you're like, this scene really doesn't have a place in the plot. But you've already spent hours perfecting it. It's going to be really, really hard to get rid of it. But if instead you look at the plot first and you make sure that everything makes sense before you dive into those details, then you can know for sure that those sentences are there to stay. So it's worth putting in the time and effort to make them as beautiful as they can be, to make them as strong as they can be. And the second thing that I also learned during my time when I was doing the master's, during my internship, my supervisor told me to look for a single thing at a time. She would ask me to do revisions, and she would ask me to check a brochure and make sure that like 10 different items on a list were the way they should be. Layout, text, all sorts of different things. And I would try to look for all those things on every single page. So I'd start on page 1, and then I'd look for all those things. And then at the end, I felt like I'd done a really good job. And then I'd hand in the brochure with my comments, and my supervisor would be like, you missed a bunch of stuff. And that would happen again and again and again, even though I felt like I was learning from her feedback. So then one day she told me, just take one item at a time, go through the entire brochure, looking for just that thing. Check all the ISBN numbers from front to back, page after page, then look for all the headings, and then look for all the whatever it was. And that saved me so much time and allowed me to find so many more issues that it's a golden nugget that I carry in my pocket ever since that day. And that I want to share with you as well, because it makes such a difference. It feels really counterintuitive, especially with something as huge as a novel. because it may feel like you're going to spend way more time going through the entire novel again and again and again, but you'll have a super clear image of what you're looking for. So every time you go through your manuscript, you'll be looking for a very specific thing, and it makes it less draining than reading your manuscript 4 times, trying to look for everything at once. And then one other thing that also falls in the big to small category that I want to share is I see a lot of writers edit by chapter, and that makes sense. I understand why you would do that. But when you're looking at the big picture, it's going to save you time if you look at the entire story at once instead of just chapter by chapter, because you may edit like 5 chapters, and then in chapter 6 you discover that there's a big plot hole that affects the chapters that you've already edited as well. So you need to go back and then edit those again, and then maybe in chapter 10 you discover something else that also affects all the previous chapters. So if you edit by chapter, you'll probably end up going back and forth a lot of the time. Whereas if you look at the entire story from start to finish, if you create an overarching outline, and you make sure that that's completely the way it should be, you've added scenes where they need to be added, and you've removed scenes where they need to be removed. When you go through the story, then you can do it all in one go. So in the end, it saves a lot of time. So the first step of my self-editing framework are the developmental edits. That encompasses all the big picture stuff. So plot, character development, world building, and timing and pace. And the first part, I recommend deep diving into character development and world building so that you have a really clear image of what you're working with and what you're looking for. I like to compare writing that first draft and how well you know your characters to meeting someone for the first time, whether it's a first date or the first meeting that you had with your best friend. In that meeting, there will probably have been something that sparked your interest and that made you feel like you already know sort of what kind of person they are. And based on that, you were happy to keep going and go on a second date, or keep meeting up for coffee. And then little by little, you became friends and then best friends. But it takes time to get to that point, because even if on that first day that you met each other, you spent hours and hours and hours talking about super deep stuff, there's always going to be aspects that you won't have talked about. And there's always going to be aspects that won't come out until you spend a lot of time with that person, until you've gone on holiday, or until you have spent the night with them, or until, I don't know, you've had a birthday party. There are a ton of different situations that you need to experience before you can know for sure that you know what that person is like in those situations. And it's the same with the characters. When you write the first draft, you know the characters in the sense that you were able to write a story about them. But you're probably going to have guessed a few behaviors or word choices and word choices is for later on. That wasn't a good example, but behaviors that aren't in line with who they really are. And that's okay, because at that point, you don't know them that well yet. You need time to pass in order to be able to see those things that you didn't know when you started writing. So that's why I also recommend taking a big break after finishing your first draft and before you start self-editing. And take a month off to let everything simmer and to create some distance between you and your work. And then when you get back to it, you really dive into your characters and your world. And when I say world building, I mean secondary worlds like in fantasy and science fiction, but also worlds that are part of the here and now. Whether it's because you're writing historical fiction and you need the details about a certain age, or because you're writing in a very specific atmosphere, for example, a small village, or because you're writing a thriller where the courtroom is very present. Those are all very different scenarios, and you need to know which aspects of that world you need to put into your book in order for the reader to feel like they're really pulled into that world. So when I say world building, it's for anyone, even if you don't write fantasy or science fiction. So all that to say, you start by diving in, getting to know your characters and your world on a really deep level. And then my approach is really character-centric, because I believe that once you know your characters inside and out, everything else becomes a natural consequence. So once you know your characters, you can take a look at your plot, because you know how your character would behave in any given situation. And when you take a look at your plot, you'll find plot holes at moments where your character is not behaving in a way that's in line with who they are and what they stand for. And when that's the case, there's a very easy solution. It sounds easier than it is, I admit, but there's an easy solution in to fix those plot holes, because you can simply consider either does this need to happen, because if you have a character that behaves like he gets very angry because of something, and you feel like they're not a person that easily gets angry, you can ask yourself, is that anger necessary for the story? If not, remove it. If it is, then you ask the next question, namely, what would it take for this character to get this angry? And once you answer that question, you can insert that information before the actual anger, and you'll have solved the plot hole. So I'm a big fan of asking your characters what it would take for them to behave a certain way, and whether it makes sense for them to behave a certain way. Then once you've covered the plot, you move on to timing and pace. And timing, for me, can be divided into two sections, namely objective timing and subjective timing. And objective timing, sorry, in fact, I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. There we go. Objective timing is tied to anything that would make sense, like would or wouldn't make sense to anyone. Like a woman who has just given birth is not going to be able to just jump out of her hospital bed and run across the hospital. Somebody who has a lethal wound won't be able to just jump up and run away from a bad guy, even if he is packed full of adrenaline. And it takes time to get from point A to point B. It takes time for things to grow. Those are the types of things that I would put under objective timing. And then subjective timing is tied to the character. For example, how quickly would this character enter a relationship with someone else? If it is a character who is in love with being in love, or who is very insecure and looking for love in a desperate way, it would make absolute sense for them to jump into a relationship with someone they barely know. But if it's someone who has trust issues and who has had trust issues for a long time, it wouldn't make sense for them to go from barely knowing someone to hopping into a relationship with them within a matter of days, unless there's something going on that's out of the ordinary. Another example of subjective timing would be when someone's ready to have kids, or how long something takes, in the sense that if you have a character who moves really slowly, then it doesn't make sense for them to go from point A to point B really quickly. And that's subjective in the sense that it's character specific. So it's not about the distance between point A and point B is 6 miles. It's about the fact that this character cannot move faster than a specific speed, and another character can. So character A will take a longer time than character B to get to that point B. And just tying back into the objective timing, there's an example that I like to use that I see really often, especially in movies, sometimes in books as well, but especially in movies, where it takes, like, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks for a group of people to get from point A to point B. And then there's something going on in the finale, and the hero needs to get there really quickly. And then suddenly he's able to make the journey, he or she is able to make the journey in 3 days. That works for the plot, but it's not very believable. So that's the reason why I recommend really diving into timing at this stage of the process. And then pace is something that I personally find very difficult to judge myself. So I would recommend doing one read through and just taking a look at if you feel like things are happening way too fast, way too quickly, or if you're spending a lot of time describing something that really doesn't warrant a huge description. Those are things that you can take note of and correct yourself. But otherwise, beta readers are a really good way to pinpoint where there are pacing issues. That brings us to the beta readers. Usually, I see writers enlisting beta readers at the very end of their revisions. So they would do the developmental edits, and then they would do the line edits, and then they would enlist beta readers. But then sometimes beta readers come back with feedback that is tied to the big picture, which is really frustrating because, again, you'll have spent so much time on polishing your sentences, and then you'll have to go back and fix the story structure and maybe remove things that you've already really worked really hard on. So that's why I recommend doing 2 beta reader rounds. One after you finished your developmental edits and one after you finished your line edits. And then it's really important to specify that you're looking for the big picture feedback here. I would recommend reaching out to around 10 beta readers and not stopping until you have at least 5. And the reason for that is that if you have just one beta reader, not only is there a chance that they will not be able to complete the beta read, there's also a chance that their feedback may not be as helpful as you thought it would be. And there's the risk of them really not liking a particular aspect of your story and being very vocal about that. But because they're on their own, you have no idea if that's their opinion and other readers actually love that part, or if it's an issue that you need to work through. And when you have 2 beta readers, the issue becomes that one of them could have a very strong opinion about not liking something, and then someone else could have a very strong opinion about liking something, which puts you in the position of, which one do I go with? So that's why I recommend having, in that sense, as many beta readers as you can, but you still want to keep it containable and you don't want it to become overwhelming. And in my experience, 5 to 10 leads to feedback that starts to be easily, that you can easily categorize. So when you have 5 to 10 people, you'll start to notice themes in the feedback. And of course, every beta reader will have their specific things that other beta readers won't notice or won't share. But when you have that overview from those 5 to 10 readers, you will end up with a list of things that you can tackle, that you know you should tackle because multiple people have brought them up. So yeah, the general rule with the beta readers, 5 to 10, do 2 rounds, one after the big picture, one after the nitty-gritty details, and be specific in the type of feedback that you're looking for. Because often beta readers are very happy to share specific feedback, but they won't know what to share. And that's where you end up with what I put in these balloons. It was great, loved it. But if you send them a few questions ahead of time, they'll probably be super happy to answer those, and that will give you the feedback that you're looking for. So keep that in mind when you're looking for beta readers. Then, once you have implemented the beta feedback and taken another break, another 4-week break, I would recommend doing those 4 weeks while your manuscript is with beta readers. So you would implement the feedback at the end of that break. You move on to line editing, or what I like to call the nitty-gritty. Things like character voice, dialogue, descriptions, word choice, sentence flow, all those things that lead to that are part of polishing your writing, strengthening your writing, and tidying up your writing. So it's changing sentences like, I walked into the room and couldn't believe how badly it smelled, to, as I walked into the room, my stomach turned and I scoured my pockets for a cloth to cover my nose. It's the same thing, but the second one really pulls the reader in, while the first one is just sharing the information without having that pull. Again, it's really important to go through one thing at a time here. And that's another pitfall I see many, many writers fall into, where they separate the big picture and the nitty-gritty, but they still try to look for everything at once. So things like adverbs, passive voice, dialogue tags, separate all of those and do a single read-through for each item. That way you make sure that you're looking for a very specific thing and that you catch as much as you can. And another tip that I have for the line editing stage is to use an editing tool like ProWriting Aid or Grammarly. I'm personally a big fan of ProWriting Aid. They have a free version that you can use. You can only insert 500 words at a time with the free version, but even if you were able to insert a full manuscript, I would recommend selecting small portions, so that shouldn't be too much of a roadblock. And ProWriting Aid it used to be on the same level as Grammarly, but they've added a ton of features that are specific to fiction writing that are really useful and come really handy when you're looking for things like adverbs and passive voice and those things, because when you're just reading your manuscript, you're going to miss some of those things, and ProWriting Aid highlights them all. And definitely use your common sense when you're using a tool, because the suggestions that they make for improvements are not always improvements, but definitely take a look at all the highlights and consider for each instance how you would improve it. That said, that's the overall process. And in the chat, I would love to hear your takeaways, if there is anyone willing to share those in the chat.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Oh my gosh, that was so quick. Thank you, Hank. He's backstage. Okay.
Yeah, it's quicker than I thought.
Yeah, me too. Oh wow. I do have a few questions.
Yes.
Okay, so firstly, the thing that stood out as being the most like, oh my gosh, wow, that's so helpful for me, was that idea of, does this scene need to happen? And then if it does need to happen, what would it take for my character to actually do this? That like, it's one of those things like, yeah, it makes logical sense. So like I heard that and I was like,
whoa. Yeah.
So
yeah, I think it's because, like I said, I'm very character centric, but I feel like a lot of writers approach the story from the outside, where it feels like you need to solve the plot. And your characters know what they're going to react, what their reactions are going to be and how they're going to act. So just ask them.
No, I totally agree. And I think like in my current project, I've actually like, as I've gotten to know my characters more and they've morphed a little bit, I started making notes of like, oh, that thing that happened is going to need to change. Like there's no way. So, which actually kind of brings me to my second question, which is editing while writing. And
that's a good one.
Do you have feelings on that? And like what do you recommend in terms of like doing any backwards looking while you're writing?
Yeah, I have strong feelings about that. Editing and writing are very different processes. It takes a different part of your brain to write and to edit. That said, when you're rewriting, you're also using those same parts of your brain that you're using when you're coming up with the story. So to me, the three major stages in the writing process are write the first draft, self-edit, have a professional look at it. Those are the three things that, like, if you want your book to be the very best it can be, those are the three things that need to come together. So self-editing is not a replacement for professional editing. it's when you put those two together that the magic happens.
Mhm.
And the same goes for writing and self-editing. Like, they're both important parts, but they need to be considered separately in order to really make the most of it. So I would recommend going through that first draft just from start to finish without editing anything. That said, reading back can be helpful for some writers, especially if you don't write every day. But keep in mind that when you read those passages, it's just to remind yourself of where you're at and not to edit. And I think maybe the best way to remind yourself of that is what I talked about earlier. Like, if you're going to put in a ton of work already, like changing the little things, it's going to be super frustrating when you discover that something needs to go, something needs to change, a character needs to be very different, all those types of things. So it feels like you're saving time in the moment, but in the end, you're actually giving yourself a lot more work and frustration.
Yeah. I think I personally have kind of reached a point where I make myself a lot of notes as I'm writing, where I'll realize things and I'll be like, oh, I'm gonna have to change that later. And so I don't want to forget. And so I have a lot of sticky notes, a lot of kind of like, remember that thing in chapter 2? Her name changed, sorry.
Taking notes is a great idea. And especially if you feel like your fingers are itching while you're writing, make sure to put it down somewhere so you won't forget it, and then move forward. And there was something else I wanted to add, but it's escaped me now.
It'll come back to you maybe.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat that actually relates to one of my questions. And my question was going to be, do you have suggestions for where to find beta readers? And then this is a great sort of follow-up to that question.
Absolutely, yeah. Where to find beta readers, I would recommend taking a look at your own network, your friends with writers and readers. And one mistake that I see writers make is that they only look for writers who want to beta read for them. And I would recommend making use of Bookstagram and looking for readers who are your target audience, because chances are they'll be super excited to get a sneak peek of a book before it's out, and they'll be super useful when it comes to figuring out whether or not you're hitting the right spots. So social media is another one. And then communities like the Story Cafe at Dabble, I think, would be a great place to look for beta readers as well. So in my experience in talking with writers, the biggest hurdle when it comes to looking for beta readers is the fear of approaching people that you don't know. And I like to switch it around, where if you would receive a message from an author saying, I'm working on a book, I've seen that you like this genre, I would love for you to read it, and I would love to hear what you think about it, I would be very excited.
I'm super flattered.
And something that I also hear a lot of writers say is that they're afraid of asking too much, because it is a time investment that you're asking from people and you're not paying them. But for me, as long as you're clear about what you're expecting and what the time frame is and all those types of things, and that you're not paying them, they have an option to say no. So as long as you make it clear to them that they're allowed to say no, it's absolutely no obligation, and you only want them to help you if they really want to, then I don't think you need to be afraid of asking for that help. And then how to protect your work from beta readers stealing your content. I think that's a very common fear, and I can't take it away fully. But at the same time, I've never come across a case in which that has happened. And you also need to remember that you are sharing your story at a stage where it's not done yet. And how to phrase this? Even if someone were to take the core of your story, they would still have to rework it, and that would make it a different story because it's no longer you writing it. And I don't think that's something that people would do. But even if that were the case, it's still not going to be what you make, how you write it. And another thing that you can do, like, it's very low key and it's not like full protection, but you can ask them to sign an NDA before you share your work, just to make sure that they know you're serious about it. And that gives you some leverage if something were to go wrong.
Right, it's documented.
Yeah, so I think it's mostly about making sure that you trust the people that you're going to work with. And I feel like if you ask people to beta read for you that you've already seen around for quite a long time, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of what they're like and if they would be prone to acting like that. And I think that stealing someone's writing isn't, it's not going to get them.
Right, it's not easy or lucrative, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's not like, I mean, if you steal a wallet, you have the money. But if you steal someone's manuscript, you're not going to be able to just publish it.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of effort even to self-publish. So I doubt that the people who would be thinking about, oh, I could steal someone's story, I honestly don't believe that they would put in the effort that it takes to then get it published.
Actually do it.
And that's my personal opinion. But I understand the fear, and I think that the best way to deal with that is to build your own confidence as a writer, and the confidence in your writing network.
Yeah. And then let's see. Finally, we have a question from Jared who says, I'm a new writer. Oh, here it is. There we go. I don't have to read that loud. And this is a good question, I think, on two fronts. One, in terms of how far back to review with an editing eye, and then also when you're thinking like, okay, let me just look back and kind of figure out where I am. In general, like, how far back do you look? I tend to read the scene before and just be like, oh, okay, yeah. Like,
exactly, yeah. So there's two things in terms of how far do you read back. If you find yourself very tempted to edit as you read back, what you could do is write down an outline on a piece of paper where you don't have any of the other content, but you still have the information that you need in order to move forward. So then you can look at those scenes and use that as a way to remind yourself where you were. And otherwise, like you, I would look at the previous scene just to remind yourself where you're at in the story and then move forward. Because even if you get something wrong in the sense that you forget a beat or anything like that, you'll get to that when you edit. And getting stuck in perma-editing mode. What do you mean by that exactly, Jared?
I think this is something I've heard other Storycraft people talk about, where it's just like as you start to reread things, that's the dangerous part. It's that like unable to kind of like
I see what you mean. Yeah. So I think I like to compare training yourself to keep writing instead of editing. I like to compare that to meditation, where you're not gonna be able to meditate for 10 minutes straight the first time you try it. You're going to get distracted. You're going to get distracted a lot of times, and that's fine. But just every time you notice yourself getting distracted, remind yourself, wait, no, this is not what I was going to do. And go back to the point where you start writing new material. And the more often you do that, the easier it becomes to just keep moving forward. And what I've also noticed myself, but also all the writers that I've guided through the self-editing process, is that knowing about the self-editing process that follows is really helpful in continuing forward, because you'll know that everything will be polished and
right. There's sort of a like, oh, I'll get to that.
Exactly. Yeah. Go back to the beginning to make sure it all flows. Then my story can even change a lot because I went back too far, and I can always find ways to make it better. Right. I think I see two things here again, where when you say you want to make sure it all flows, that sounds to me like, right. That sounds to me like you're looking at sentence level. And if you take the approach that I just explained, where you start with the big picture and then move on to the sentence level, you'll be confident that the story is good the way it is, because you'll have gone over that as often as you need to make sure that you're confident in it. So then when you move to the line editing stage in the nitty gritty, you can really focus on that flow and making sure that everything flows nicely. And when it comes to that, I do recommend multiple read-throughs. Like I said, you separate all the tiny little things like adverbs, passive voice, dialogue tags, like really tiny things, and you look through the entire manuscript looking for just those things. And when you've done that for all the things that you need to look at, your story is going to be much stronger, so that with a final read-through or two, you'll probably be able to catch all the sentences that don't flow the way you want them to. So when it comes to the rereading, I think it's really a matter of remembering that it takes practice. You're not going to be able to just stop doing that cold turkey. So whenever you find yourself rereading, remind yourself, no, wait, I'm moving forward now, and I'll get back to that later.
Yeah. I sometimes, like, kind of every once in a while, will go back and sort of like skim through the whole thing, especially if I have changed something. Like, I'm like, okay, this character like no longer exists, or I just added a character that needed to get added a long time ago. I'll go back and like kind of skim through the whole thing in order to put those notes in. Like, oh, this is where that person needs to come in. And then that way, when I get to the editing phase, I have handy little memory notes in there. Also, side note, there is a very large spider on my wall right now. So I'm
that was your expression of
so, I'm fine, in case anyone was wondering. Just crawling around. Okay, and then I think that's all of our questions in the chat. Are there other things you'd like to share with us before we finish up?
Yeah, I would like to share a special offer for double users, or like the people in the Storycraft Cafe. I actually have a slide for that, so if we could pull those back up. Yay, thanks.
So fast.
Yeah, that was really fast. So the special offer is I have a self-editing academy that goes through the entire process of self-editing your book from start to finish. It also has modules that cover mindset, so it's also already very useful when you're drafting. And when you enroll in the Self-Editing Academy within 24 hours, you get a free upgrade to the VIP package, which entails lifetime access to the Academy and 2 hours of one-on-one self-editing coaching. So the Academy is an online course. There's a community that goes with it where you can ask questions that are specific to your novel, but these 2 hours would be really focused on your specific manuscript and the things that you struggle with.
Do those 2 hours have to happen within a certain time frame? Or
no, not at all. Just I would recommend doing one with the developmental edits and one with the line edits, but you're free to use those as you see fit. And you can find the special offer right here.
And what I will do is I'll actually ask you to send me that link, and then I will put it in the cafe with this recording, so that way people who come to see the recording today, since it is quite early, will also have a chance to look at that. And that would be awesome. Well, thank you. This is super helpful. I took some notes as I was going along, and I'm looking forward to just kind of shouting this out in the cafe again and making sure that people know that this is a good resource to look back on when they get to that phase, and then also to sort of mentally prepare.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's really useful if you're still drafting as well, just to know what's coming next.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll see you around in the cafe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you so much.